In Chicago's South Side, a 72-year-old widow was about to prove everyone wrong. What started as neighbors whispering cruel predictions took a shocking turn when winter itself became her greatest test. Lara Kowalski wasn't your typical elderly resident. For decades, she had been the neighborhood's fierce guardian, known for her unbreakable determination. When she encountered a furnace failure during the coldest night on record, she had no idea she was walking into a crisis that would unite an entire community. Lara's stubborn survival would lead to extraordinary bonds. What began as whispered death sentences would become a story of triumph. The community would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled against the windows like an angry ghost, rattling the old glass panes in their warped frames. Lara Kowalski pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders and checked the thermometer hanging outside her kitchen window. 15 below zero. The numbers blurred for a moment before her eyes adjusted, a reminder that her 72 years were catching up with her whether she acknowledged them or not. She shuffled to the stove, her slippers whispering against the linoleum that had seen better decades. The kettle sat waiting, same spot it had occupied every morning for 37 years. Same burner, same routine. Stanley used to joke that she could make tea in her sleep. Now she sometimes wondered if that's exactly what she was doing, sleepwalking through the motions of a life that felt increasingly hollow. The furnace in the basement groaned to life, a sound that had become more labored with each passing winter. Like everything else in this house, it was hanging on through stubborn determination rather than reliability. Lara understood the feeling. She'd been telling herself for months that she needed to call someone about that noise. But winter repair bills could eat through her pension faster than the January wind cut through the gaps around her windows. Steam rose from her mug as she settled into the kitchen chair that had molded itself to her shape over the years. Through the frost-etched window, she could see the house across the street, the Hendersons' old place. Another for sale sign had sprouted from the snow-covered lawn like a tombstone. That made 3 on her block alone. The bright red letters seemed to mock the neighborhood's slow decay, promising renewal to buyers who would likely gut whatever character remained. Mrs. Chen's corner store beckoned through the swirling snow, its neon sign a lone beacon in the gray morning. Lara needed milk, and more importantly, she needed to prove to herself that she could still navigate the treacherous sidewalks. Her cane waited by the door, a concession to practicality that she'd finally accepted after a fall last spring. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, though she kept that revelation to herself. The walk to Chen's took twice as long as it used to. Each step required careful consideration, each breath turned to vapor that obscured her vision. But she made it, stamping snow from her boots as the electronic chime announced her arrival. The store's warmth enveloped her like an embrace, and she nodded to Mrs. Chen, who looked up from behind the counter with the kind of smile that held decades of shared mornings. "Cold one today, Mrs. Kowalski," the older woman observed, her accent still carrying traces of Hong Kong, despite 30 years in Chicago. "You should not be out in this weather." "Can't let a little snow keep me prisoner in my own house," Lara replied, though she knew Mrs. Chen was right. She moved carefully through the narrow aisles, past the emergency candles and canned goods that seemed to multiply during winter storms. Near the dairy case, she heard familiar voices, the Jimenez couple from 2 houses down. They were speaking in hushed tones, but in a store this small, privacy was an illusion. "Can't keep going like this," the woman was saying. "She's got to be what, 75? 80? 72. Her husband corrected. "But you're right. Living alone in that old house, especially after what happened to the Ramirez place last month." Lara's hand tightened on the milk carton. The Ramirez house had suffered a burst pipe that flooded half the first floor. Water damage, mold, insurance battles. The family had moved in with relatives while repairs dragged on. "I heard her son's been trying to get her into one of those senior places," Mrs. Jimenez continued. Can't blame him, she won't last another winter in that house. Look at her. She can barely make it to the store. Lara's cheeks burned with something that wasn't cold. She stood frozen, milk carton in hand, listening to her neighbors dissect her life with the casual certainty of people who thought they understood survival. They meant well, she knew that. But their concern felt like quicksand, pulling her down into a definition of herself that she refused to accept. That's enough, Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the conversation with quiet authority. Mrs. Kowalski has been taking care of herself longer than most. Show some respect. The Jimenez couple fell silent, suddenly aware of the possibility that their words might have been overheard. Lara emerged from behind the dairy case, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. She placed the milk on the counter with deliberate care. Just the milk today, she said to Mrs. Chen, ignoring the uncomfortable glances from her neighbors. Mrs. Chen rang up the purchase without comment, but when she handed over the change, her weathered fingers briefly touched Lara's palm. A small gesture of solidarity that meant more than a dozen well-intentioned speeches. The walk home felt longer, each step weighted with the echo of overheard judgments. Won't last another winter. The words followed her like shadows, settling into the spaces between her thoughts. Back in her kitchen, the phone began ringing with the persistence of bad news. Ma, thank God you answered. David's voice carried the strained patience of someone who'd been calling for days. I've been worried sick. How are you handling this storm? I'm fine, David, same as I was yesterday when you called. Listen, I've been doing some research, and I found this really nice place in Naperville. Assisted living, but it's more like a retirement community. They have activities, meals included, medical staff on site. I could drive out this weekend and… David. Her voice carried the authority of 45 years of motherhood. We've discussed this. Have we? Because discussing usually involves listening to both sides, and you haven't listened to anything I've said for months. His frustration leaked through the phone line. Ma, be reasonable. You're living alone in a house that's falling apart, in a neighborhood that's, well, you know what it's like now. Lara looked around her kitchen, at the cabinet doors that hung slightly crooked, the faucet that required just the right touch to stop dripping, the windowsill where she'd grown herbs every summer since 1965. Falling apart, perhaps, but still standing, still home. This is where I belong, David. Belonging doesn't keep you warm when the furnace dies. It doesn't help when you fall and can't get up. Ma, I love you, but love means wanting you to be safe. The line went quiet except for the sound of his breathing. She could picture him in his suburban office, surrounded by the orderly life he'd built. Successful practice, beautiful house, 2 kids who called her Grandma Lara with dutiful affection. He'd escaped this neighborhood's slow decay, and now he couldn't understand why she wouldn't do the same. I'll think about it, she said finally, the lie sitting bitter on her tongue. After hanging up, Lara stood at her front window, watching a young man in an expensive coat walk slowly down her street. He stopped in front of each house, making notes on a tablet, his eyes calculating square footage and potential. Another developer, probably. They'd been circling the neighborhood like vultures for months, drawn by the scent of cheap real estate and the promise of gentrification gold. This one was different, though. Younger. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world, never questioned whether he belonged somewhere. When he paused in front of her house, studying the small front garden where Stanley's roses still bloomed each summer, despite her increasingly arthritic care, something cold settled in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The man made a note, looked up at her windows. She stepped back instinctively and moved on. But his presence lingered like smoke, another reminder that change was coming, whether she welcomed it or not. The neighborhood was being measured, appraised, prepared for transformation. And people like her were simply obstacles to be cleared away. Evening came early in January, darkness seeping through the windows by 5 o'clock. Lara settled into Stanley's old recliner with a box of photographs, a ritual that had become both comfort and torment. Here was David at 6, gap-toothed and proud in his Little League uniform. Margaret at her high school graduation, heading off to California with dreams of becoming a teacher. Tommy in his army dress blues, so young and serious it made her heart ache. 3 children raised in this house. 37 years of marriage lived between these walls. Stanley's workshop in the basement, still exactly as he'd left it. Tools hanging on pegboard with the precision of a man who believed everything had its proper place. The pencil marks on the doorframe marking the children's heights, year by year, until they grew too tall and too old to care about such measurements. How could David understand what it meant to leave all of this behind? He'd taken his memories with him when he moved to the suburbs, packaged them neatly alongside his ambitions. But her memories were woven into the fabric of this place. The creak of the third stair, the way afternoon light fell across the living room carpet, the sound of Stanley's key in the front door lock. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the old house, finding every weakness, every gap in the armor she'd spent decades helping to build. Tomorrow would bring another phone call from David, another conversation about practicality and safety. The developers would continue their patient circling. The neighbors would keep whispering their predictions about her inevitable surrender. But tonight, in the house that had sheltered her through 47 winters, Lara Kowalski sat surrounded by the evidence of a life fully lived. And despite what everyone seemed to think, she had no intention of giving up without a fight. The wind could howl all it wanted. She'd heard worse. The photographs slipped from her lap as sleep took her, images of younger faces scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. In her dreams, the house was warm and full of voices, Sunday dinners and birthday parties, the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that seemed larger somehow, more alive. When she woke hours later, the fire had died to embers, and the cold was creeping in through every crack and crevice, as persistent and patient as time itself. Marcus's hand tightened on the coffee mug as he watched through his kitchen window. The old woman across the street moved carefully through the snow, her cane finding purchase on the icy walkway, with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that one wrong step could change everything. Lara Kowalski. He'd grown up 3 houses down from her, back when this neighborhood hummed with life. Kids playing stickball in the streets, barbecue smoke drifting from backyards on summer evenings, the sound of Mr. Kowalski's radio carrying Cubs games through open windows. That was before the slow hemorrhage began, before the factory closures and the white flight and the gradual surrender that left half the block looking like broken teeth in an old man's smile. Marcus had returned 5 years ago to care for his grandmother, and stayed after her funeral because leaving felt like abandonment, but staying felt like drowning. The coffee had gone cold in his hands. His 12-hour shift at Northwestern Memorial didn't start for another hour, but sleep had become elusive lately. Too many nights spent calculating moving expenses, researching neighborhoods with better schools for Keisha, weighing the cost of safety against the weight of guilt. His savings account had finally reached the threshold. Enough for first month, last month, security deposit on a place in Rogers Park, or maybe even Evanston. Somewhere Keisha could walk to school without him holding his breath until she texted that she'd arrived safely. But watching Mrs. Kowalski navigate her own small daily victories made his stomach clench with something that felt uncomfortably like shame. She'd been making that walk to Chen's store every morning for as long as he could remember, refusing to acknowledge that the world had shifted around her. Yesterday's overheard conversation at the store still echoed in his mind. The casual certainty with which people discussed her inevitable defeat. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was planning his own escape while judging her for refusing to surrender. His phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. "Uncle M, you awake? Need help with college essay. Due today." He smiled despite his mood. The girl had inherited the Williams family talent for procrastination, but also their stubborn intelligence. Northwestern University had already accepted her early admission application, full scholarship, pre-med track. The future he'd never had was spreading out before her like a golden road. If they could just survive long enough for her to walk it. The radiator in his kitchen clanked to life. a sound that reminded him of Mrs. Kowalski's furnace. He'd heard it struggling through the walls between their houses, the labored wheeze of machinery pushed beyond its limits. The sound triggered his nurse's instincts, the same way a patient's irregular breathing made him reach for the call button. Something was wrong, and getting worse. Through the window, he watched her disappear into her house, the front door closing with the finality of a coffin lid. How many mornings had he witnessed this same routine? How many times had he considered knocking on that door, offering help that his grandmother had taught him was the foundation of neighborhood life? But Mrs. Kowalski wore her independence like armor, and he'd learned to respect the barriers people built around their vulnerabilities. Still, the sound of that furnace nagged at him. Across the street, Lara stood in her kitchen, staring at the basement door with the kind of dread usually reserved for medical diagnoses. The furnace had been making new sounds for 3 days now, not just the familiar groans of age, but something deeper. A grinding metal-on-metal shriek that spoke of parts wearing away, of systems approaching failure. She'd descended the basement stairs yesterday with a flashlight and her father's old toolbox, determined to identify the problem before it identified itself. The basement held 47 years of accumulated life, Christmas decorations in labeled boxes, Stanley's workbench still scattered with half-finished projects, stacks of National Geographic that she'd saved for reasons she could no longer remember. The furnace crouched in the corner like a hibernating beast, its blue pilot light flickering with what seemed like uncertainty. She'd checked the obvious things. Air filter, dirty but not catastrophic. Thermostat connections, secure. Gas line, no smell of leaks. But the grinding continued, and each time it kicked on, the sound grew more pronounced. Like a creature in pain, she thought, and immediately felt foolish for the anthropomorphism. Stanley would have known what to do. He'd maintained this house with the devotion of someone who understood that neglect was a luxury they couldn't afford. After his death, she'd tried to learn the basics, when to call for help, when to tackle problems herself, but mechanical failures spoke a language she'd never fully mastered, and the learning curve felt steeper with each passing year. The phone rang, interrupting her contemplation of basement disasters. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the rail, the other gripping the flashlight like a talisman. "Mrs. Kowalski? This is Rosa Martinez. I'm with the Southside Community Development Initiative." The voice was young, enthusiastic, carrying the kind of energy that Lara associated with door-to-door salespeople and religious missionaries. She'd learned to be wary of both. "I'm conducting a neighborhood survey about community needs and resources. Would you have a few minutes to speak with me? I'm actually right outside your house." Lara peered through the front window and saw a young Latina woman standing on her porch, tablet in hand, smile visible even through the glass. Something about her posture, patient but determined, reminded Lara of her daughter Margaret at that age. All fierce conviction and untested idealism. Against her better judgment, she opened the door. "Thank you so much for your time," Rosa said, stamping snow from her boots. "I know it's cold, but I'm trying to get a comprehensive picture of what this community needs to thrive." Thrive? The word tasted foreign in Lara's mouth. "Look around, dear. We're barely surviving." Rosa's smile didn't waver. "That's exactly why we need to understand the challenges residents are facing. Housing issues, safety concerns, access to services. And what exactly do you plan to do about any of it?" Lara's tone sharpened. She'd heard variations of this speech before, usually followed by promises that evaporated like morning frost. "We're working on several initiatives. Weatherization assistance for older homes, community safety programs, advocacy for better city services." Rosa consulted her tablet. "Can you tell me about any maintenance issues you might be experiencing? Heating, plumbing, electrical." The furnace chose that moment to cycle on, its mechanical scream echoing through the house like a death rattle. Rosa's eyebrows rose slightly, and Lara felt heat creep up her neck, part embarrassment, part frustration. "It's an old house," she said simply. "There are programs that can help with heating system repairs," Rosa offered gently. "Financial assistance for seniors on fixed incomes. Would you like me to—" "I don't need charity." The words came out harder than Lara intended, but Rosa didn't flinch. It's not charity, Mrs. Kowalski. It's community support. Neighbors helping neighbors. She glanced around the porch, taking in the peeling paint and warped boards with the eyes of someone trained to assess need. How long have you lived here? 52 years. Since 1962. Then you've seen this neighborhood at its best. You know what it's capable of being. Rosa's voice carried a conviction that made Lara look at her more carefully. We're not trying to change the community's character. We're trying to help it survive. The word hung between them, loaded with implications. Survival. It seemed to be the theme of every conversation lately. David's worried phone calls, the neighbors' whispered predictions. Now this earnest young woman with her tablet full of solutions. I'll think about it, Lara said, the same lie she'd told her son. After Rosa left, promising to return with information about heating assistance programs, Lara stood in her living room listening to the house settle around her. Every building had its own vocabulary of sounds, the way floorboards announced footsteps, how windows rattled in their frames when the wind picked up, the particular groan of pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. She'd learned this house's language over decades of living within its walls. But the furnace was speaking in a dialect she didn't recognize, and the translation filled her with dread. By mid-afternoon, when David's car pulled into her driveway unannounced, she was ready for a fight. "Ma, what the hell is that noise?" He stood in her kitchen, expensive overcoat still buttoned, listening to the basement's mechanical symphony with the expression of someone calculating repair costs. "Language, David. Don't language me. When's the last time you had that thing serviced?" He was already moving toward the basement door, his take-charge energy filling the small kitchen like smoke. "I can handle my own house maintenance." "Can you? Because it sounds like a garbage disposal eating a chainsaw down there." He paused with his hand on the doorknob, and when he turned back to her, his expression had shifted from irritation to something softer and more dangerous. Pity. "Ma, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's obviously not." "I'm not pretending anything. I'm dealing with it." "How? By ignoring it until it breaks completely?" David's voice rose, frustration bleeding through his carefully maintained patience. "Do you have any idea what it costs to replace a furnace? Or what happens if this one dies in the middle of a storm like the one they're forecasting for tonight?" She did know, actually. The weather reports had been increasingly dire all week. Another polar vortex, temperatures dropping to dangerous lows, wind chills that could kill. The kind of storm that separated the survivors from the casualties. "I've been through worse winters than this," she said, but the words felt hollow even to her. David disappeared into the basement, and she listened to his footsteps on the wooden stairs, the sound of him moving around Stanley's old domain. When he returned, his face was grim. "Ma, the heat exchanger is cracked. You've got rust flakes all over the floor down there, and I can see daylight through some of the ductwork." He sat heavily in one of her kitchen chairs, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. "This isn't about being independent anymore. This is about being safe." The assisted living brochures emerged from his briefcase like evidence in a trial. Glossy pamphlets featuring silver-haired models engaged in pottery classes and group yoga, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness that came with 3 meals a day and 24-hour medical supervision. "Look at this place, Ma." He spread the brochures across her kitchen table like a hand of cards. "Meadowbrook Manor. It's only 20 minutes from my house. You'd have your own apartment, but there's a dining room, activities, other people your age." "Other people waiting to die, you mean?" "Other people living their lives without worrying about whether their furnace will make it through the night." David's voice cracked slightly, and she realized he was scared. Not frustrated or impatient, genuinely frightened. For her. "I can't keep lying awake wondering if you're okay. Keisha asks about you constantly. She's worried too." The mention of his daughter, her granddaughter, hit harder than the rest of his arguments. Keisha, brilliant and beautiful, and headed for Northwestern in the fall, carrying the worry of an old woman's stubborn choices. "I'll get the furnace looked at," Lara conceded. "When?" "Soon." "That's not an answer, Ma. That's a stall tactic. David gathered up the brochures with the careful movements of someone trying not to lose his temper. I'm going to call around, get some repair estimates. But if the cost is too high, if the system can't be fixed safely, then I'll figure something out. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw Stanley in his eyes. The same combination of love and exasperation that had characterized her husband's approach to her more stubborn moments. 10 years ago, I would have believed that, David said finally. But Ma, things change. People change. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit when you need help. After he left, the house felt larger and colder, as if his presence had been the only thing holding the walls together. Lara sat at her kitchen table, staring at the single brochure he'd forgotten, Meadowbrook Manor, where every day is a new adventure in comfortable living. Outside her window, she could see Marcus Williams loading groceries into his car, probably getting ready for another shift at the hospital. Rosa Martinez's business card lay on the counter where she'd left it, the phone number printed in cheerful blue ink. Even Tony Ricci was visible, working on the Garcia's front steps despite the cold, his breath forming clouds as he hammered loose boards back into place. The neighborhood was full of people living their lives, making choices, moving forward while she sat frozen in a house that was slowly falling apart around her. The furnace cycled on again, its cry echoing through the basement like a question she didn't know how to answer. Darkness was coming early again, and with it, the promise of another brutal night. The weather reports spoke of record-breaking cold, the kind of temperatures that turned mechanical failures into life-threatening emergencies. But in this kitchen, surrounded by 52 years of accumulated love and memory, Lara Kowalski sat listening to her house whisper warnings she wasn't ready to hear. The foundation was cracking, both literally and metaphorically. The question was whether she had the strength to shore it up, or if it was finally time to admit that some battles couldn't be won through stubbornness alone. The community center's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, their metal frames clicking against the linoleum as residents settled in for what Rosa Martinez had optimistically labeled a neighborhood visioning session. The radiators along the walls hissed and clanked, fighting a losing battle against the January cold that seeped through single-pane windows and under doors that had warped beyond proper closure. Jake Morrison checked his tablet one final time before stepping to the front of the room. 23 attendees, better than he'd expected for a Tuesday evening in this weather, though he recognized the calculation behind most of their presence. Free coffee and donuts had drawn as many people as genuine civic interest. Still, 23 was enough for what he needed. His presentation slides were loaded and ready. Artist renderings of tree-lined streets, modern townhomes with energy-efficient windows, a mixed-use development that would bring retail and services back to a neighborhood that had been steadily hemorrhaging both. Southside Renaissance, he'd titled the project, bold but not too bold, aspirational but grounded in market realities. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on such a brutal night. Jake's smile was practiced, warm but professional. I'm Jake Morrison with Morrison Development Group, and I'm here because I believe this community has incredible potential. From the third row, Lara Kowalski studied the young man with the careful attention she'd once reserved for customers bringing suspicious alterations to her shop. Everything about him spoke of comfort and confidence. The expensive winter coat hung carefully over his chair, the tablet computer that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget, the way he moved through space as if he'd never doubted his right to occupy it. She hadn't planned to attend Rosa's meeting. Community gatherings had always been Stanley's domain. He'd enjoyed the debates and discussions that left her feeling drained and skeptical. But something about the flyer Rosa had left, your voice, your neighborhood's future, had nagged at her throughout the day. After David's visit and the revelation about her furnace, the idea of sitting at home listening to mechanical death rattles had become unbearable. I know some of you might be skeptical about development, Jake continued, advancing to his first slide, a photograph of the neighborhood from 1965, when the streets hummed with activity and the houses wore fresh paint like Sunday clothes. But I'm not here to change what makes this community special. I'm here to help restore it. Mrs. Chen shifted in her seat beside Lara, her expression unreadable. At 68, She'd survived enough promises of neighborhood improvement to recognize the patterns. The careful language that made displacement sound like opportunity. The way revitalization inevitably meant the departure of people who couldn't afford to stay revitalized. "These are preliminary concepts," Jake said, clicking to a slide showing sleek townhomes where the Henderson house currently stood empty. Mixed-income housing that respects the neighborhood's character while providing modern amenities. Energy-efficient heating and cooling, updated electrical systems, universal accessibility features. From the back of the room, Marcus Williams leaned forward in his chair. He'd arrived 15 minutes late, still wearing scrubs from his shift at Northwestern Memorial, with his 16-year-old niece, Keisha, beside him. The girl was taking notes on her phone with the intensity of someone who understood that decisions made in rooms like this could reshape her entire world. What does mixed income actually mean? Marcus's voice carried the tired authority of someone who'd worked a 12-hour shift and still showed up because showing up mattered. Because in my experience, that usually means expensive units with a handful of affordable ones thrown in to satisfy some city requirement. Jake's smile didn't waver, but Lara caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Great question. We're looking at a 30-70 split, 30% market rate, 70% affordable housing. The goal is to create economic diversity while ensuring long-term residents aren't displaced. And who determines affordability?" The question came from Rosa, who stood near the back with a clipboard, and the expression of someone keeping score. Affordable for whom? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. HUD guidelines. Typically 60 to 80% of area median income, which is how much? Keisha's voice cut through Jake's explanation with the clarity of youth unimpressed by bureaucratic jargon. In actual numbers. Jake consulted his tablet, and Lara noticed the slight pause. The calculation of how much truth this room could handle. For a family of 4, that would be approximately $45,000 to $60,000 annually. The silence that followed was weighted with knowledge. Lara didn't need to look around to know the math was already happening in every head. Social security checks, disability payments, part-time wages from jobs that paid just enough to disqualify people from assistance, but not enough to cover rising rents. "Mr. Morrison." Mrs. Chen's voice carried the diplomatic precision of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating between languages and cultures. "Your pictures are very beautiful. But I have seen many beautiful pictures over the years. What I have not seen is how people like Mrs. Jimenez," she gestured toward an elderly woman in the front row, "who has lived here 40 years, will afford to stay in these beautiful new houses." Jake advanced to another slide, this one showing a community garden and what appeared to be a small retail space. "Part of our vision includes support for existing small businesses and community anchors. We want to preserve what works while improving what doesn't." "Like what?" The question came from Tony Ricci, who'd slipped in during the presentation and now stood near the door as if ready to bolt. His work clothes were paint-stained, and his hair needed cutting, but his eyes were sharp with the kind of intelligence that came from understanding how things actually worked versus how people claimed they worked. While housing stock that's energy inefficient, infrastructure that needs updating, the lack of retail and service businesses that force residents to travel outside the neighborhood for basic needs. Lara felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the drafty community center. Housing stock. As if her home, with its crooked cabinets and temperamental furnace and 52 years of accumulated love, was nothing more than an inefficient unit of inventory. "My house was built in 1952, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "It's heated my family through 62 winters. Raised 3 children who went to college and became productive citizens. Sheltered a marriage that lasted 37 years. She paused, meeting Jake's eyes directly. "Exactly how inefficient is that?" The room's energy shifted, conversations stopping as neighbors turned to look at the old woman who rarely spoke at community gatherings. Jake's presentation had suddenly become a dialogue, and not the kind he'd prepared for. "Mrs. Bells, I'm sorry, I don't have your name. Kowalski, Lara Kowalski. Mrs. Kowalski, I absolutely respect the history and memories you've built in your home. That's exactly the kind of community character we want to preserve. Jake's tone had shifted, becoming more personal, more careful. But surely you'd agree that everyone deserves access to safe, efficient housing? Heating systems that work reliably, electrical that meets modern safety standards. My heating system has worked reliably for decades. The lie came easily, defensive pride overriding honesty. And I don't recall asking for your opinion about my electrical. Keisha looked up from her phone, studying the exchange with the analytical attention of someone who understood power dynamics better than most adults. Mr. Morrison, where do you live? The question seemed to catch him off guard. That's not really relevant to Lincoln Park, Rosa said from the back of the room, consulting her own notes. 2-bedroom condo. Purchased last year for $450,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Lara did quick mental math. More than 10 times what she and Stanley had paid for their house. More than her total household income for the past decade. How did you know that? Jake asked, his professional composure slipping slightly. Public records. Rosa replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Same way you know that the average household income in this neighborhood is $28,000, and that 60% of residents are over 55, and that we've lost 300 families in the past 5 years. You've done your research. So have we. Marcus leaned back in his chair, recognizing the moment when polite conversation shifted into something more substantial. This wasn't a community meeting anymore. It was a negotiation, with stakes none of them could afford to lose. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. You speak of preserving community character. But character is not buildings. Character is people. Mrs. Martinez, who runs the daycare from her home. Mr. Santos, who fixes everyone's cars in his garage. Mrs. Kowalski, who has watched this neighborhood's children grow up for 50 years. She paused, letting the words settle. If these people cannot afford to stay, what character are you preserving? Jake clicked through several slides without speaking, his presentation suddenly feeling inadequate against the weight of lived experience filling the room. The artist renderings looked sterile now. Pretty pictures that had no space for the messy reality of people who'd built lives in places the market had forgotten. I understand your concerns, he said finally, and I want to work with the community to address them. That's why I'm here tonight, having this conversation instead of just filing permits and breaking ground. Is it? Lara's question cut through his diplomatic response. Or are you here because Rosa organized us to show up? Because someone taught you that it's easier to manage community opposition than fight it. The accuracy of her observation created an uncomfortable silence. Jake Morrison had indeed attended seminars on community engagement, had read case studies about the importance of stakeholder buy-in, had learned that successful development required careful management of neighborhood concerns. But sitting in this overheated community center, facing people whose lives his project would fundamentally alter, he found himself genuinely uncertain about his own motivations. The profit margins were solid, the market analysis compelling. Southside properties were undervalued, ripe for the kind of strategic investment that could generate substantial returns while ostensibly improving living conditions. Yet something in Lara Kowalski's eyes, a combination of intelligence, wariness, and bone-deep fatigue, made him question assumptions he'd never bothered to examine. Mrs. Kowalski, he said, setting aside his tablet and speaking directly to her, what would you want to see happen in this neighborhood? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Around the room, neighbors leaned forward slightly, recognizing that something important was happening, a moment of genuine dialogue in a conversation that had been scripted from the start. I want to see my neighbors able to afford their homes, she said finally. I want Mrs. Chen's store to have enough customers to stay open. I want children to be safe walking to school. I want young people like Keisha to have reasons to come back after college, instead of reasons to leave forever. She paused, looking around the room at faces she'd known for decades. I want this place to survive without losing its soul. The meeting continued for another hour, but the tone had shifted. Jake's presentation became secondary to conversations between neighbors who rarely gathered in the same room. discussions about heating costs and property taxes, about children's futures and elderly parents' needs, about the delicate balance between improvement and displacement. By the time people began folding chairs and pulling on coats, nothing had been resolved. Jake promised follow-up meetings and community input sessions. Rosa distributed sign-up sheets for neighborhood organizing committees. Mrs. Chen invited everyone to stop by her store for continued discussions over coffee and conversation. But as Lara walked slowly through the parking lot, her cane-finding purchase on salted asphalt, she carried with her the weight of recognition. Change was coming, whether they welcomed it or not. The question was whether they could shape that change or simply survive it. Behind her, she could hear Keisha talking animatedly with Rosa about social media strategies and voter registration drives, their voices carrying the energy of people who believed action could alter outcomes. Beside them, Marcus walked silently, his expression thoughtful as he processed the evening's revelations about his neighborhood's precarious future. And in his expensive car, Jake Morrison sat for several minutes before starting the engine, staring through his windshield at a community that had suddenly become more complicated than his market research had suggested. The drive back to Lincoln Park would give him time to think, to recalibrate his approach for the challenges he hadn't anticipated. But for now, in the parking lot of a community center that needed new windows and better heating, the real work was just beginning. The work of neighbors learning to speak with one voice about futures they might not control, but could still influence. The work of survival in a world that measured value in dollars per square foot and saw inefficiency in anything that couldn't be optimized. The work of people like Lara Kowalski, who understood that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to disappear. The weather report crackled through Lara's old radio like a death sentence. Record-breaking cold front moving through the Chicago area tonight. Temperatures dropping to 20 below zero, with wind chills approaching 40 below. This is a life-threatening weather event. Residents are urged to stay indoors and check on elderly neighbors. Lara turned off the radio with more force than necessary. Elderly neighbors, as if she were some fragile creature who needed constant monitoring, rather than a woman who'd survived 62 Chicago winters. The condescension in the announcer's voice reminded her uncomfortably of David's worried lectures and Jake Morrison's polite assumptions about her inefficient housing. But as she stood in her kitchen, listening to the wind begin its assault on the old windows, she couldn't deny the fear creeping up her spine like cold fingers. The furnace had been struggling all day, cycling on and off with increasing desperation. Each time it kicked in, the grinding sound grew worse, metal screaming against metal, in a mechanical death song that made her stomach clench. She'd called 3 heating repair companies that morning. The first had put her on hold for 20 minutes before disconnecting. The second had quoted a service call fee that exceeded her monthly grocery budget, with no guarantee they could fix whatever was wrong. The third had laughed, actually laughed, when she'd described the symptoms and the age of her system. "Lady, that furnace should have been replaced a decade ago," the dispatcher had said with casual cruelty. "We can come out and pronounce it dead for you, but that's about all." Now, as darkness fell with the premature finality of January evenings, Lara found herself alone with a dying heating system and temperatures that could kill. She'd lived through the blizzard of 78, the ice storm of 98, countless polar vortexes that had tested her resolve and her heating bills. But she'd never faced a Chicago winter without Stanley, without the steady presence of someone who understood the house's rhythms as intimately as she did. The furnace shuddered to life again, its protest echoing through the basement like a wounded animal. This time, the grinding was accompanied by a new sound, a high-pitched whine that spoke of bearings worn beyond salvation. Lara closed her eyes and counted. The system ran for 37 seconds before shutting down with a mechanical sigh that sounded like surrender. When it tried to restart 5 minutes later, nothing happened except the click of the thermostat calling for heat that would never come. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the grinding had been. Silence meant failure. Silence meant the battle was over, and she'd lost. Lara stood in her kitchen, watching her breath begin to form small clouds in the rapidly cooling air, and faced the arithmetic of survival. The house had been losing heat steadily for hours. Without the furnace, it would reach dangerous temperatures within a few hours. She could call David, endure his "I told you so" lectures and his immediate insistence that she pack a bag and leave this place forever. She could swallow her pride and dial 911, become another elderly victim of inadequate infrastructure, a cautionary tale for the evening news. Or she could fight. Moving with purpose born of desperation, Lara began her preparations. Every blanket in the house went into the living room, along with pillows from the bedrooms and couch cushions arranged into a makeshift fortress around Stanley's old recliner. She dragged the space heater up from the basement, an ancient thing that Stanley had warned her never to leave unattended, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The kitchen stove became her primary heat source. She turned all 4 burners to high and opened the oven door. Despite knowing the dangers, carbon monoxide poisoning was a risk, but hypothermia was a certainty. She cracked 2 windows an inch to provide ventilation, then stuffed towels around the gaps to minimize heat loss. In Stanley's workshop, she found candles left over from power outages, thick, long-burning ones that could provide both heat and light. She arranged them throughout the living room, creating a constellation of small flames that pushed back against the gathering cold. The effect was almost medieval, as if she were a peasant holed up against besieging armies, rather than a modern woman battling mechanical failure. By 8 o'clock, wearing 3 sweaters, 2 pairs of socks, and Stanley's old winter coat, Lara had created a survivable microclimate in her living room. The temperature hovered somewhere in the 40s, cold enough to see her breath, but warm enough to prevent frostbite. She rationed the space heater's usage, running it for 15 minutes every hour to prevent the electrical system from being overwhelmed. But survival and comfort were different things entirely. Her joints ached with the kind of deep cold that seemed to seep into her bones, and every breath required conscious effort. The candles provided psychological warmth more than actual heat, their flickering creating shadows that danced across photographs of better times. She was arranging another layer of blankets when she heard it, the distinctive crunch of footsteps in snow, coming up her front walk. Her first instinct was relief. Someone had noticed her absence of chimney smoke, the lack of warm light in her windows. But relief quickly gave way to embarrassment. Whoever was out there would see her reduced to this primitive survival strategy, would witness the failure she'd been trying so hard to hide. The knock came tentatively, as if the visitor understood they might be intruding on something private and difficult. "Mrs. Kowalski? It's Marcus Williams from across the street. I wanted to check on you." Through the peephole, she could see him stamping his feet against the cold, his nurse's training evident in the way he carried himself, alert for signs of distress, ready to act if needed. Behind him, the streetlights illuminated a neighborhood already surrendering to the brutal cold. No smoke rising from chimneys, no warm glow from windows. Just the stark geometry of houses battening down against nature's assault. She almost didn't answer. Pride warred with pragmatism. Independence clashed with the simple human need for connection in crisis. But something in Marcus's posture, patient but concerned, offering help without demanding explanation, made her turn the locks. "I'm fine," she said through the barely opened door, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Just conserving heat." Marcus's eyes took in the candles visible behind her, the way she was bundled in multiple layers, the subtle signs of someone fighting for survival rather than simply enduring discomfort. "Mrs. Kowalski, your furnace isn't running. I can see from my kitchen window. There's no exhaust steam from your chimney." The observation was gentle but definitive, delivered with the authority of someone trained to assess crisis situations. Lara felt her carefully constructed denial begin to crumble. "It's just temporarily out of service," she said, the euphemism sounding ridiculous even to her own ears. "Ma'am, with all due respect, it's going to be 20 below tonight. Temporarily out of service could be fatal." Marcus shifted his weight, and she could see him calculating options, assessing the severity of her situation. "When's the last time it worked?" The question hung between them, and Lara realized that lying would be both pointless and dangerous. Marcus had spent 5 years watching her daily routines, had grown up 3 houses down from her, back when this neighborhood was a place where people looked out for each other. He knew her well enough to recognize desperation disguised as stubbornness. "Around 6 o'clock, she admitted. Maybe a little after." 2 hours. In temperatures this extreme, 2 hours without heat in an old house was approaching emergency territory. Marcus's expression shifted from concern to professional assessment. The look she'd seen on David's face when he'd examined her basement, the same calculation of immediate danger versus long-term solutions. Mrs. Kowalski, you can't stay here tonight. This isn't about pride or independence. This is about basic survival. I'm managing fine. She gestured toward her living room fortress, the candles and blankets and improvised heating system. I've been through worse. Not at 72, and not alone. Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen hypothermia cases in the emergency room, who understood how quickly cold could transition from discomfort to death. Look, I've got heat across the street, and a guest room that's not being used. Just for tonight, until we can figure out. I'm not leaving my home. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. This house held 52 years of her life, every memory that mattered, every connection to the person she'd been when the world still made sense. Leaving tonight might mean never coming back. David would see to that, would use this crisis as evidence of her inability to care for herself. Marcus studied her face, recognizing the depth of her determination. He'd seen it before, in trauma patients who refused treatment despite obvious need, in elderly people who chose familiar danger over unfamiliar safety. Sometimes the will to remain autonomous was stronger than the instinct for survival. Okay, he said finally. Then I'm staying here. What? You're not leaving, and I'm not leaving you alone to freeze to death. So I'm staying. He pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. I'm texting my niece to let her know where I am. She can handle herself for one night. Lara stared at him, this man she'd known as a child, who'd grown into someone with his own responsibilities and problems. You don't need to. Mrs. Kowalski, my grandmother used to tell me that neighborhoods aren't about property lines. They're about people taking care of each other. She'd haunt me forever if I let something happen to you because I was too polite to insist on helping. The mention of his grandmother, Mrs. Williams, who'd brought soup when Lara had pneumonia 3 years ago, who'd shared garden vegetables and grandchildren's accomplishments until her death last spring, created a connection that transcended pride. This wasn't charity or pity. It was the continuation of bonds that had held this community together through decades of decline. I suppose you could stay, Lara said, stepping back to let him in. But I'm warning you, it's not exactly comfortable in here. Marcus entered her living room fortress and surveyed her survival arrangements with professional appreciation. Actually, this is pretty smart. You've created a heat sink in the smallest space. Maximized insulation provided multiple heat sources. Not bad for emergency engineering. His approval meant more than she'd expected. For the first time since the furnace had died, Lara felt something other than desperation. Marcus arranged his own blankets on the couch, checked the windows to ensure adequate ventilation with the gas stove running, and helped her adjust the candle placement for maximum safety and warmth. My shift starts at 7, he said, settling into his makeshift bed. But I've already called in, told them I'm dealing with a family emergency, which isn't exactly a lie. Family emergency. The phrase created warmth that had nothing to do with candles or space heaters. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, temperatures plummeting toward levels that could kill within minutes of exposure. But inside Lara's living room, surrounded by blankets and flickering light, 2 neighbors had created something stronger than mechanical heating systems. They'd created the kind of human warmth that no furnace could provide, the heat of connection, of refusing to let someone face the darkness alone. It was the first crack in the wall Lara had built around her isolation, the beginning of understanding that survival sometimes required accepting help rather than rejecting it. As the longest, coldest night of the winter deepened around them, they talked quietly about the neighborhood's past and uncertain future, their voices joining the symphony of small sounds that proved life persisted even in the harshest conditions. The furnace was dead, but something else, something more essential, had begun to kindle in its place. The phone call came at 5:47 a.m., dragging Rosa Martinez from the kind of deep sleep that only follows 16-hour days of community organizing. Her phone screen showed Marcus Williams' number, and something in the early hour made her stomach clench with anticipation of bad news. "Rosa? It's Marcus. I'm at Mrs. Kowalski's house. Her furnace died last night, and it's bad, really bad." Rosa was already reaching for her clothes, the urgency in Marcus's voice cutting through the fog of interrupted sleep. "Is she okay? Do you need an ambulance?" "She's stable for now, but we spent the night in her living room with candles and a space heater. The house is maybe 40 degrees. I've got to leave for work in an hour, and I can't leave her alone in this." Through her apartment window, Rosa could see the kind of brutal morning that made Chicago famous. Crystalline air that hurt to breathe, ice forming on the inside of windows, the bitter clarity that came with temperatures designed to kill. She'd grown up in Tucson. This level of cold still felt like a personal attack. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, already pulling on layers. "And Marcus?" "Thank you for staying with her." The drive through the neighborhood revealed a community under siege. Steam rose from the few chimneys still producing heat, while other houses sat dark and silent. Their owners either fled to warmer places or hunkered down with whatever heating they could afford. The streetlights illuminated a landscape stripped to its essentials: survival or surrender, warmth or cold, community or isolation. Rosa parked behind Marcus's car and could see the glow of candles through Lara's front windows, a medieval beacon in a world of failed technology. She knocked softly, not wanting to startle anyone who'd spent the night in crisis. Marcus opened the door wrapped in blankets, his nurse's training evident in the way he immediately assessed her for signs of cold exposure. "She's asleep," he whispered, gesturing toward the living room where Lara was curled in Stanley's recliner, looking smaller and more fragile than Rosa had ever seen her. "How bad is the furnace situation?" "Dead. Completely dead. Heat exchanger is cracked, and even if we could get someone out here today, we're probably looking at full replacement." Marcus's expression was grim. 20,000 minimum, and that's if the ductwork doesn't need major repair. Rosa did quick mental math, more than Lara's annual income, more than most residents of this neighborhood saw in 2 years. The kind of expense that transformed minor mechanical failure into permanent displacement. There have to be emergency programs, city assistance. Maybe, eventually, but not today, and not fast enough to keep her from freezing. Marcus gathered his things with the efficient movements of someone running out of time. "I called in sick yesterday, but I can't do it again. They'll fire me, and then I can't help anyone." The dilemma was stark. Marcus needed to work to maintain the income that let him help others, but leaving Lara alone could be a death sentence. Rosa watched him struggle with the impossible mathematics of survival in a world where caring for neighbors was a luxury few could afford. "Go," she said. "I'll stay with her until we figure something out." "Rosa, you don't understand how cold this house gets. It's not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Then we need to figure out something better than candles and space heaters." Rosa's mind was already working, cataloging the resources and connections that 3 years of community organizing had taught her to map. "Who do we know with heating expertise?" Marcus paused in his preparations, considering. "Tony Ricci used to do HVAC work back before—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Rosa understood. Before the drinking, before the job losses, before Tony became one of those neighborhood residents that people talked about in whispers rather than conversations. "Is he reliable now?" "I don't know, but Mrs. Kowalski seems to think so, and she's usually a pretty good judge of character." Marcus shouldered his work bag. "Rosa, if this goes bad, if she gets hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning from those candles—" "It won't. We won't let it." After Marcus left, Rosa settled into the strange intimacy of crisis vigil. Lara's living room had been transformed into a survival bunker, every surface covered with blankets and makeshift heating solutions. The air smelled of candle wax and propane from the gas stove, with an undertone of cold that seemed to leach heat from her body despite the layers of clothing. Lara woke around 8 o'clock, her movements careful and stiff with cold. "You don't need to be here," she said, but without the sharp edge Rosa had expected. Crisis had worn away some of the defensive barriers that usually surrounded the older woman. "I need to be somewhere," Rosa replied, adjusting the space heater's position to maximize warmth. Might as well be somewhere useful. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the house settle around them with the particular sounds of a building under thermal stress. Rosa found herself studying Lara's face in the candlelight. The sharp intelligence in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held herself with dignity despite circumstances that would have broken many people. "Mrs. Kowalski, can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Can't guarantee I'll answer." "Why is staying here so important to you? I mean, really. Beyond the obvious reasons." Lara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades spent thinking about belonging and displacement. "You know what happens when places like this get improved, Rosa? The old people disappear first, too expensive to maintain, too inconvenient to accommodate. Then the families who've been here for generations, priced out by property taxes that rise faster than their incomes. Finally, all the small businesses that made this a community instead of just an address." She gestured toward the photographs scattered around the room, images of block parties and graduation celebrations, of neighbors who'd shared decades of small kindnesses. "I've watched it happen in other neighborhoods. They call it revitalization, but what it really means is erasure. All the messy, complicated, beautiful history gets painted over with something cleaner and more profitable." Lara's voice grew stronger, warming to her theme. "If I leave now, if I give in to David's worrying and Jake Morrison's improvements, then Stanley's workshop becomes storage space for someone who never knew him. Mrs. Chen's store gets replaced by a coffee shop that charges $5 for what she sells for 50 cents. Rosa nodded, understanding finally clicking into place. This wasn't just about one stubborn old woman refusing to accept help. This was about the front lines of a battle being fought in neighborhoods across the city. The struggle between market forces that saw inefficiency in everything that couldn't be optimized, and human forces that recognized value in things that couldn't be quantified. "So what do? We fixed the damn furnace." The declaration hung in the cold air between them, audacious in its simplicity. Rosa pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to the city's emergency heating assistance line, busy, then to 3 heating contractors, booked solid for weeks, then to the gas company, willing to check for leaks but not fix heating systems. By noon, she'd exhausted the official channels and moved into the network of community connections that did the real work when institutions failed. Mrs. Chen had offered her store as a warming center. The Rodriguez family had a propane heater they could lend. Even the Jimenez couple, who'd whispered about Lara's survival prospects just days ago, called to offer help. But the call that mattered came from Keisha Williams. "Miss Martinez? Uncle Marcus gave me your number. I've been thinking about Mrs. Kowalski's situation, and I might know someone who can help." The girl's voice carried the particular mix of confidence and uncertainty that marked bright teenagers navigating adult problems. "There's this guy Tony who does work around the neighborhood. Uncle Marcus mentioned him, and I've seen him fixing things. I looked him up online. He used to have an HVAC business before things got complicated for him." Rosa found herself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "And you think he might be willing to help?" "I think he might be willing to try. And right now, trying is better than freezing." 20 minutes later, Tony Ricci knocked on Lara's door with a toolbox that had seen better decades, and an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure why he'd agreed to this. His work clothes were clean but well-worn, and he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned not to make promises he couldn't keep. "Mrs. Martinez called," he said simply. "Said you might need some help with heating." Lara studied him with the same careful attention she'd given Jake Morrison, but her assessment reached a different conclusion. Tony's hands showed the calluses of real work, and his eyes held the particular wariness of someone who'd made mistakes and learned from them. "You know anything about furnaces from 1967? "Know a little about everything from 1967, Tony replied with a slight smile. "Mind if I take a look?" The basement expedition revealed the extent of the disaster, not just the cracked heat exchanger that David had diagnosed, but a system held together by prayers and mechanical tape. Tony moved through the space with the confidence of someone reading a familiar language, pointing out problems that ranged from dangerous to merely inconvenient. Heat exchangers shot, like your son said. But the blower motor's good, gas valve works fine, and the ductwork just needs some attention. He ran a hand along the main supply line, feeling for air leaks. Question is whether you want to keep this old beast limping along, or if you're ready for something new. New costs money I don't have. Old costs time I do have. Tony's expression was matter of fact, without pity or judgment. I can't give you a new system, but I might be able to give you heat. Temporary fix, maybe get you through the rest of winter. Give you time to figure out something more permanent. Rosa watched the negotiation with fascination. This wasn't charity. It was the kind of practical problem-solving that happened when people who understood scarcity worked together to solve immediate problems. What would something like that cost? Parts, maybe 300. Labor. Tony paused, considering. Mrs. Kowalski, you remember when I was drinking heavy? Couple years back, you were the only one on this block who'd still say hello, still treated me like a person instead of a problem. Lara's expression softened slightly. Everyone's got their struggles, Tony. Yeah, well, turns out kindness is something you can pay back. He closed his toolbox with a decisive snap. Let me see what I can do. No promises, except that I'll try my best. As Tony began the careful work of emergency heating repair, the house filled with purposeful activity. Rosa coordinated the delivery of temporary heaters and extra blankets. Keisha arrived with thermoses of hot soup from Mrs. Chen's store. Even neighbors who'd barely spoken to Lara before found reasons to stop by, checking on her welfare, offering assistance, creating the kind of community response that transformed individual crisis into collective action. By evening, Tony had worked a small miracle. The furnace wasn't restored to full function, but it was producing heat. Uneven, inefficient, requiring constant monitoring, but enough to raise the house temperature to livable levels. The grinding noise was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of machinery doing what it was designed to do. It's not going to last forever, Tony warned, wiping grease from his hands. Few months maybe, if you're lucky, but it'll get you through winter. Lara stood in her kitchen, feeling warm air circulate for the first time in 18 hours, and realized that something more than her heating system had been repaired. The isolation that had defined her life since Stanley's death had cracked open, revealing the community that had always existed beneath the surface of neighborhood life. Tony, she said as he packed up his tools, thank you. Thank me when we get through February, he replied. But he was smiling, and Rosa could see the satisfaction of competence restored, of skills put to meaningful use after too many months of feeling useless. The community response to Lara's crisis had revealed something that no amount of community organizing meetings could have accomplished: the recognition that survival was a collective responsibility, that individual struggles were community problems requiring community solutions. In one day, neighbors who'd barely acknowledged each other had become allies, working together to solve problems that none of them could handle alone. As the house warmed and the immediate danger passed, Rosa understood that they'd crossed a threshold. The crisis had ended, but the connections it had forged would endure. For the first time since she'd started working in this neighborhood, she felt the stirring of something that might actually deserve the name hope. The steady rhythm of Tony's wrench against reluctant bolts created a percussion that seemed to echo through the entire house. 3 days after the emergency repair, he was back in Lara's basement, this time with proper parts and the luxury of working without the threat of immediate hypothermia. The temporary fix had held, but barely, like a tourniquet that stopped the bleeding while everyone figured out how to perform actual surgery. Lara descended the basement stairs carefully, carrying a mug of coffee that had become their daily ritual. Tony had arrived each morning at 8 o'clock sharp, worked until dark, and refused any payment beyond meals and conversation. His transformation from neighborhood pariah to essential community member fascinated her. The way purposeful work had straightened his shoulders and cleared the uncertainty from his eyes. "How's the patient today?" she asked, settling onto Stanley's old workbench stool. "Getting better," Tony emerged from behind the furnace, his face streaked with soot but his expression satisfied. Found the real problem yesterday. Wasn't just the heat exchanger. Whole combustion chamber was compromised. Someone tried to patch it with furnace cement about 10 years ago, probably when the first cracks appeared. Lara remembered that repair, Stanley's last attempt to squeeze another winter from their aging system. He'd spent an entire weekend in this basement, muttering about parts costs and the indignity of being defeated by machinery he'd maintained for 3 decades. He always said this furnace was like an old dog, she said. Too stubborn to die, too loyal to abandon. Tony's laugh was genuine, carrying none of the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to from people who felt sorry for her. Sounds about right. But even old dogs deserve proper veterinary care. The work had attracted an audience over the past few days. Mrs. Chen had appeared yesterday afternoon with tea and pronouncements about the proper way to approach mechanical problems. Patience and respect. Machines are like people, they respond better to kindness than force. Marcus stopped by each evening after his hospital shifts, bringing medical supplies to treat the inevitable cuts and burns that came with furnace repair, while asking questions that revealed his growing understanding of home maintenance. Even Keisha had become a regular presence, ostensibly doing homework at Stanley's workbench but actually observing Tony's methodical approach to complex problems. Her college acceptance letter had arrived 2 days ago, Northwestern University, full scholarship, pre-med track. But instead of celebration, the achievement had brought its own complications. Uncle Marcus thinks I should study biomedical engineering, she said, looking up from her calculus textbook. But I keep thinking about yesterday, when Mr. Ricci figured out that combustion chamber problem. The way he diagnosed it, methodically checking each system until he found the root cause. That's basically what doctors do, right? Except he's fixing the things that keep people's homes working instead of fixing the people themselves. Tony paused in his work, considering her observation. Different kind of medicine, I suppose, but diagnosis is diagnosis. You listen to what's wrong, test your theories, and keep looking until you find something you can actually fix. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. David Kowalski appeared, still wearing his expensive overcoat and carrying the expression of someone who'd expected to find his mother alone and struggling. Ma, what's going on down here? Your neighbor called and said there were people working on the house. David's tone carried the particular mix of concern and irritation that Lara had learned to recognize as his default mode when confronted with situations he couldn't control. His eyes took in Tony's tools spread across Stanley's workbench, Keisha's textbooks, the evidence of community collaboration that had been invisible to him from his suburban distance. Tony's fixing the furnace, Lara said simply. Properly this time. Tony? David looked at the older man with the suspicious assessment of someone trained to evaluate risk. Are you licensed? Insured? What exactly are your qualifications for working on a gas heating system? The questions hung in the basement air like accusations. Tony straightened slowly, and Lara could see him calculating whether this conversation was worth the potential conflict. She'd watched him navigate similar moments over the past few months. The careful dance of someone whose reputation had been damaged by past mistakes, who understood that every interaction was an audition for respectability. I ran Ricci Heating and Cooling for 15 years, Tony said finally, his voice level but carrying an undertone of something that might have been wounded pride. Licensed master technician, until things got complicated for me. Paperwork's lapsed, but the knowledge doesn't disappear. Things got complicated. David's tone suggested he knew exactly what that euphemism covered. And you think that makes you qualified to work on my mother's heating system? What happens if something goes wrong? If there's a gas leak or carbon monoxide poisoning? Keisha looked up from her textbook, her expression sharpening with the kind of righteous anger that only teenagers could muster. What happens if nothing gets done? She almost froze to death 3 days ago while you were in your heated house complaining about her choices. Keisha, Lara started, but the girl was warming to her theme. Mr. Ricci has been here every day, working for free, while you've been calling with lectures about assisted living. Mrs. Chen brings food, Mr. Williams checks on her after his shifts, Miss Martinez coordinates community resources. Where exactly have you been in all this community support? David's face flushed with the particular embarrassment of being called out by someone young enough to be his daughter. I've been trying to convince my mother to make rational decisions about her safety. This, he gestured around the basement, isn't a solution. It's a band-aid that's gonna fail, probably when she needs it most. Unlike the solutions you've proposed, Lara's voice carried the authority of 45 years of motherhood. Moving to a place where I don't know anyone, leaving behind everything that makes my life meaningful so you can stop worrying about phone calls in the middle of the night? The truth of her assessment created an uncomfortable silence. David's concerns were genuine, but they were also selfish, driven as much by his own anxiety as by her actual needs. His love for her was real, but it came wrapped in assumptions about what constituted proper care, what kind of help was acceptable, what level of risk was worth tolerating. Tony resumed his work, the sound of his wrench providing rhythm for the tension that filled the basement. Finally, David spoke again, his voice quieter but no less troubled. "Ma, I just want you to be safe." "I know, honey. But safety isn't just about furnaces and medical alert systems. It's about being surrounded by people who know your story, who understand where you come from and why it matters." Lara gestured toward the basement around them. Stanley's tools, the projects he'd never finished, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in partnership with someone who'd understood the importance of making things work. "Tony understands this house the way your father did. Not because he has the right paperwork, but because he sees it as something worth saving instead of something that needs to be replaced." The observation landed with the weight of revelation. David had inherited Stanley's intelligence and work ethic, but not his patience with imperfection. Where his father had seen challenges to be solved, David saw problems to be eliminated. Where Stanley had found satisfaction in making old things work better, David saw inefficiency that needed to be optimized. Mrs. Chen's voice called down from the kitchen, announcing her arrival with the diplomatic timing of someone who'd learned to diffuse family tensions through the strategic application of food. "I brought lunch for the workers. Soup and sandwiches." The basement emptied slowly, everyone grateful for the interruption. In the kitchen, Mrs. Chen had arranged her offerings with the care of someone who understood that shared meals could accomplish what arguments couldn't. Hot soup, fresh bread, the kind of simple comfort that reminded people why they'd gathered in the first place. David found himself sitting at his mother's kitchen table between a teenage girl discussing biomedical engineering and a recovering alcoholic explaining the physics of heat transfer. The conversation flowed around topics he couldn't contribute to: community organizing strategies, the relative merits of different furnace designs, Keisha's plans for college, and her concerns about leaving the neighborhood behind. For the first time in months, he was seeing his mother not as an elderly woman requiring management, but as the center of a web of relationships that provided support more comprehensive than any assisted living facility could offer. Mrs. Chen knew about her arthritis medications. Marcus monitored her health with professional competence. Rosa connected her to resources and advocacy. Tony maintained her house with the devotion of someone who understood that buildings, like people, deserved care rather than abandonment. "The truth is," Mrs. Chen said, refilling David's coffee cup with the automatic hospitality of someone who'd fed 3 generations of neighborhood children, "your mother has been taking care of this community longer than most of us have lived here. When my husband died, when the Ramirez family had their fire, when Mrs. Garcia needed someone to watch her children during her cancer treatments, always, your mother was there. Now it's our turn," Keisha added with the moral clarity of someone too young to accept that good intentions weren't always enough. "That's how neighborhoods are supposed to work, isn't it? People taking care of each other instead of just taking care of themselves?" David looked around the table, at faces that had become familiar through crisis, at the evidence of community that had emerged from what he'd seen as his mother's stubborn isolation. The furnace repair had become something larger than mechanical fix. It was proof that alternative forms of care were possible, that aging in place didn't have to mean aging alone. "How long will the repair last?" he asked Tony, the question carrying weight beyond its mechanical implications. "With proper maintenance? Could be years. Won't be pretty, and it'll need attention, but it'll keep her warm." Tony's assessment was honest without being discouraging. "Course, that assumes she's got people checking on it regular. making sure everything's running right. She does, Marcus said from across the table, the certainty in his voice speaking to commitments that had been made without formal discussion. We all do. The afternoon passed in the kind of comfortable activity that David remembered from childhood, adults working on practical problems while conversation flowed around topics both serious and mundane. He found himself staying longer than he'd planned, drawn into discussions about community organizing and neighborhood preservation, about the difference between improvement and displacement. When Jake Morrison knocked on the door around 4 o'clock, the kitchen was full of people who'd learned to be wary of unannounced visitors bearing development plans. "Mrs. Kowalski, I hope I'm not interrupting," Jake said, his eyes taking in the assembled group with the calculated assessment of someone who'd learned to read room dynamics. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation from the community meeting." "Which conversation?" Lara's tone was polite but cool. "The one where you explained how inefficient my heating system was, or the one where you suggested that my house was an obstacle to neighborhood improvement?" Jake's prepared remarks seemed to evaporate under the weight of her direct challenge. The kitchen was suddenly very quiet, everyone waiting to see how the well-dressed young developer would respond to being confronted by the community he claimed to want to help. "Actually," he said finally, "I wanted to apologize for that, and to ask if there might be ways to support what you're doing here instead of replacing it." The offer hung in the air like smoke, carrying possibilities that no one in the room had expected. Outside, the winter afternoon was settling into the kind of cold that tested both mechanical systems and human resolve. But inside Lara's kitchen, warmed by Tony's repaired furnace and sustained by the connections that crisis had revealed, something new was beginning to take shape. Something that looked remarkably like hope. Jake Morrison's apologies settled over Lara's kitchen like fresh snow, unexpected, transformative, and requiring careful navigation. The young developer stood in the doorway, his expensive coat, a stark contrast to the working clothes and lived-in comfort that had defined the past week's community gatherings. Everyone waited, suspended between skepticism and the possibility that sincerity might be replacing calculation. "May I sit down?" Jake asked, and when Lara nodded toward an empty chair, he moved with less of his usual confidence. "I've been thinking about what you said at the community meeting, Mrs. Kowalski. About efficiency and what it actually means." Rosa leaned back in her chair, her community organizer instincts alert for manipulation disguised as revelation. She'd seen too many developers discover the value of community input when opposition threatened profit margins. But something in Jake's posture suggested this might be different, a young man genuinely grappling with assumptions he'd never questioned. "I drove through Lincoln Park last weekend," Jake continued, his voice carrying a hesitation that hadn't been there during his polished presentation. "Really looked at it, not just as market comparables but as a place where people live. Those beautiful renovated buildings, the trendy restaurants, the tree-lined streets that everyone photographs for social media." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And I realized I couldn't name a single person who'd lived there before the renovation. Not one. The efficiency everyone celebrates. It erased an entire community's worth of stories." Tony wiped grease from his hands, studying Jake with the assessment of someone who'd learned to read sincerity in the aftermath of his own failures. "So what changed your mind? Week ago you were pretty convinced about your Renaissance project. Honestly, watching this." Jake gestured around the kitchen, taking in the evidence of community mobilization that had transformed crisis into collective action. "I've been developing properties for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here. Mrs. Martinez, organizing resources. Mr. Williams providing medical oversight. You fixing a system that every HVAC company said was beyond repair. Mr. Kowalski," he nodded toward David, "I've seen how much you care about your mother's well-being." David shifted uncomfortably, still processing his own revelations about community care versus institutional solutions. "It's not that I don't appreciate what everyone's done, it's just, what happens next winter? Or the winter after that? This can't be sustainable." "Why not?" Keisha's question carried the directness of someone too young to accept that good solutions were inherently temporary. "Why can't neighbors helping neighbors be sustainable?" "Because people move away, get sick, die," David replied with the brutal honesty of someone who'd been calculating actuarial tables since his mother's first fall. What happens when Mr. Ricci isn't available? When Mr. Williams gets transferred to another hospital? When Mrs. Martinez moves on to organize some other community? The questions hung in the air, each one a small weight added to the scales that balanced hope against pragmatism. Around the table, people who'd been energized by their successful response to immediate crisis found themselves confronting the harder mathematics of long-term sustainability. "Those are fair concerns," Rosa said finally. "But they're also why we need to think bigger than individual solutions." She pulled out her tablet, the same one she'd used for door-to-door surveys, now loaded with research that had kept her up late for the past 3 nights. "I've been looking into community land trusts, cooperative ownership models, programs that keep neighborhoods stable without displacing existing residents." The presentation that followed was different from Jake's polished slides, but no less compelling. Rosa had documented successful examples from Chicago's other neighborhoods, resident-owned buildings that maintained affordability across generations, community-controlled development that preserved character while improving conditions, models that treated housing as community infrastructure. "The Kenwood Oakland Community Organization has been doing this for decades," she explained, showing photographs of restored buildings and thriving businesses. "Resident ownership, community control of development, programs that build wealth for existing families instead of displacing them." Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her expression interested but cautious. "This sounds very hopeful, Rosa, but also very complicated. Who pays for these improvements? Who makes decisions about what changes and what stays the same?" That's where it gets interesting. Rosa's enthusiasm was infectious, carrying the energy of someone who'd found solutions to problems that had seemed intractable. "Community ownership means decisions get made by the people who actually live here, not by developers or city planners who see us as data points." She turned to Jake, her expression challenging but not hostile. "Mr. Morrison, you said you wanted to support what we're doing instead of replacing it. What would that actually look like?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Lara could see him processing implications that extended far beyond his original project scope. When he spoke, his voice carried the uncertainty of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. "I don't know," he admitted. "My experience is with traditional development. Acquire properties, improve them, sell or rent at market rates. What you're describing is completely different from anything I've worked on." "Different doesn't mean impossible," Marcus said, speaking up from where he'd been listening, with the careful attention of someone whose own plans had been upended by community connections. "I was ready to move out of this neighborhood 6 months ago. Had the apartment deposit saved, applications filled out, whole exit strategy planned." Keisha looked at her uncle with surprise. "You never told me that. Didn't want to worry you before I was sure. But sitting here now, seeing what we accomplished in 1 week when people actually worked together," Marcus shook his head. "Maybe the problem isn't the neighborhood. Maybe the problem is that we've been trying to solve everything individually instead of collectively." The conversation that followed sprawled across topics that would have seemed impossibly complex a week earlier. Community ownership structures, resident-controlled development, the difference between improvement and displacement. But the crisis had taught them to think in practical terms about complex problems, to break down overwhelming challenges into manageable pieces. Tony emerged as an unexpected voice in the planning, his experience with both construction and economic hardship providing insights that academic theories couldn't capture. "Any plan that depends on people having money they don't have is going to fail," he said bluntly. "But if you can create ways for people to build equity through sweat instead of cash, that's different." "Sweat equity," Rosa repeated, making notes. "Resident labor as investment in community ownership. That could work, especially if we can access grants and low-interest loans for materials and professional oversight." Jake found himself drawn into discussions about financing mechanisms he'd never considered. Community development financial institutions, programs that treated neighborhood stability as social good rather than market outcome, models that measured success in community well-being rather than profit margins. "I could provide technical expertise," he offered tentatively. "Project management, permitting navigation, contractor coordination. Not as a developer taking profit, but as someone contributing skills to community-controlled projects." The offer was met with cautious interest. David, who'd been quiet through much of the discussion, finally spoke up with the practical concerns that accountancy had trained him to identify. This all sounds idealistic, but what about liability? Insurance? What happens when community decisions conflict with building codes or zoning requirements? What happens when people disagree about priorities? Same things that happen in any development project, Rosa replied with a smile. Except the people making decisions are the ones who have to live with the consequences. The afternoon stretched into evening, as the conversation evolved from theoretical possibilities to specific planning. Mrs. Chen offered her store as a meeting place for ongoing discussions. Marcus volunteered to research successful community land trust models in other Chicago neighborhoods. Even David found himself agreeing to help with financial planning and legal structure research. But it was Lara's quiet observation that gave weight to all the enthusiastic planning. 52 years I've lived in this house, and this is the first time I've felt like I had any say in what happened to my neighborhood. The statement carried the authority of someone who'd watched communities rise and fall, who'd survived urban renewal and white flight, and the slow hemorrhage of disinvestment. Her endorsement wasn't just personal, it was historical validation that what they were discussing represented genuine change rather than well-intentioned repetition of failed strategies. As people began gathering coats and making plans for follow-up meetings, Jake lingered behind, clearly struggling with something he needed to say. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to tell you something. My company has options on 3 properties on this block already, including the Henderson house across the street. The admission created sudden tension in the warm kitchen. Rosa's expression sharpened, and David looked like he was calculating the implications of option contracts and development timelines. I could exercise those options, proceed with traditional development, probably make a substantial profit, Jake continued. Or I could let them expire, forfeit the money I've already invested, and try to figure out how to make this community ownership thing actually work. What do you want from us? Lara asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of developers bearing gifts. Honestly, I want you to convince me that this is possible. That community-controlled development isn't just a beautiful theory that falls apart when it meets zoning boards and construction loans and all the practical realities that make traditional development so traditional. It was Rosa who answered, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd spent 3 years learning that beautiful theories only mattered if they could survive contact with ugly realities. Mr. Morrison, a week ago Mrs. Kowalski was facing a choice between freezing to death and leaving her home forever. Today she's sitting in a warm kitchen, surrounded by neighbors planning the future of their community. If we can solve a crisis that fast when we work together, imagine what we could accomplish with actual time and resources. The challenge hung between them, as Jake made his calculations: profit margins versus community impact, proven strategies versus uncertain experiments, individual success versus collective possibility. Outside, the winter night was settling over a neighborhood that had spent the week discovering it was more resilient than anyone had imagined. Inside Lara's kitchen, warmed by Tony's rebuilt furnace and sustained by connections that crisis had revealed, the future was being negotiated one conversation at a time. The bigger picture was finally coming into focus, and it looked nothing like anyone had expected. Jake Morrison's apology settled over Lara's kitchen like fresh snow, unexpected, transformative, and requiring careful navigation. The young developer stood in the doorway, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the working clothes, and lived in comfort that had defined the past week's community gatherings. Everyone waited, suspended between skepticism and the possibility that sincerity might be replacing calculation. "May I sit down?" Jake asked, and when Lara nodded toward an empty chair, he moved with less of his usual confidence. "I've been thinking about what you said at the community meeting, Mrs. Kowalski, about efficiency and what it actually means." Rosa leaned back in her chair, her community organizer instincts alert for manipulation disguised as revelation. She'd seen too many developers discover the value of community input when opposition threatened profit margins. But something in Jake's posture suggested this might be different, a young man genuinely grappling with assumptions he'd never questioned. "I drove through Lincoln Park last weekend," Jake continued, his voice carrying a hesitation that hadn't been there during his polished presentation. really looked at it, not just as market comparables but as a place where people live. Those beautiful renovated buildings, the trendy restaurants, the tree-lined streets that everyone photographs for social media. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, and I realized I couldn't name a single person who'd lived there before the renovation. Not one. The efficiency everyone celebrates. It erased an entire community's worth of stories. Tony wiped grease from his hands, studying Jake with the assessment of someone who'd learned to read sincerity in the aftermath of his own failures. So what changed your mind? Week ago you were pretty convinced about your Renaissance project. Honestly? Watching this. Jake gestured around the kitchen, taking in the evidence of community mobilization that had transformed crisis into collective action. I've been developing properties for 5 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here. Mrs. Martinez organizing resources, Mr. Williams providing medical oversight, you fixing a system that every HVAC company said was beyond repair. Mr. Kowalski? He nodded toward David. I've seen how much you care about your mother's well-being. David shifted uncomfortably, still processing his own revelations about community care versus institutional solutions. It's not that I don't appreciate what everyone's done. It's just, what happens next winter, or the winter after that? This can't be sustainable. Why not? Keisha's question carried the directness of someone too young to accept that good solutions were inherently temporary. Why can't neighbors helping neighbors be sustainable? Because people move away, get sick, die, David replied, with the brutal honesty of someone who'd been calculating actuarial tables since his mother's first fall. What happens when Mr. Ricci isn't available? When Mr. Williams gets transferred to another hospital? When Mrs. Martinez moves on to organize some other community? The questions hung in the air, each one a small weight added to the scales that balanced hope against pragmatism. Around the table, people who'd been energized by their successful response to immediate crisis found themselves confronting the harder mathematics of long-term sustainability. Those are fair concerns, Rosa said finally, but they're also why we need to think bigger than individual solutions. She pulled out her tablet, the same one she'd used for door-to-door surveys, now loaded with research that had kept her up late for the past 3 nights. I've been looking into community land trusts, cooperative ownership models, programs that keep neighborhoods stable without displacing existing residents. The presentation that followed was different from Jake's polished slides, but no less compelling. Rosa had documented successful examples from Chicago's other neighborhoods, resident-owned buildings that maintained affordability across generations, community-controlled development that preserved character while improving conditions, models that treated housing as community infrastructure rather than individual commodity. The Kenwood Oakland Community Organization has been doing this for decades, she explained, showing photographs of restored buildings and thriving businesses, resident ownership, community control of development, programs that build wealth for existing families instead of displacing them. Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her expression interested but cautious. This sounds very hopeful, Rosa, but also very complicated. Who pays for these improvements? Who makes decisions about what changes and what stays the same? That's where it gets interesting. Rosa's enthusiasm was infectious, carrying the energy of someone who'd found solutions to problems that had seemed intractable. Community ownership means decisions get made by the people who actually live here, not by developers or city planners who see us as data points. She turned to Jake, her expression challenging but not hostile. Mr. Morrison, you said you wanted to support what we're doing instead of replacing it. What would that actually look like? Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Lara could see him processing implications that extended far beyond his original project scope. When he spoke, his voice carried the uncertainty of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. I don't know, he admitted. My experience is with traditional development. Acquire properties, improve them, sell or rent at market rates. What you're describing is completely different from anything I've worked on. Different doesn't mean impossible, Marcus said, speaking up from where he'd been listening with the careful attention of someone whose own plans had been upended by community connections. I was ready to move out of this neighborhood 6 months ago. Had the apartment deposit saved, applications filled out, whole exit strategy planned. Keisha looked at her uncle with surprise. You never told me that. Didn't want to worry you before I was sure. But sitting here now, seeing what we accomplished in 1 week when people actually worked together, Marcus shook his head. Maybe the problem isn't the neighborhood. Maybe the problem is that we've been trying to solve everything individually instead of collectively. The conversation that followed sprawled across topics that would have seemed impossibly complex a week earlier. Community ownership structures, resident-controlled development, the difference between improvement and displacement. But the crisis had taught them to think in practical terms about complex problems, to break down overwhelming challenges into manageable pieces. Tony emerged as an unexpected voice in the planning, his experience with both construction and economic hardship providing insights that academic theories couldn't capture. Any plan that depends on people having money they don't have is going to fail, he said bluntly. But if you can create ways for people to build equity through sweat instead of cash, that's different. Sweat equity, Rosa repeated, making notes. Resident labor as investment in community ownership. That could work, especially if we can access grants and low-interest loans for materials and professional oversight. Jake found himself drawn into discussions about financing mechanisms he'd never considered, community development financial institutions, programs that treated neighborhood stability as social good rather than market outcome, models that measured success in community well-being rather than profit margins. I could provide technical expertise, he offered tentatively, project management, permitting navigation, contractor coordination, not as a developer taking profit, but as someone contributing skills to community-controlled projects. The offer was met with cautious interest. David, who'd been quiet through much of the discussion, finally spoke up with the practical concerns that accountancy had trained him to identify. This all sounds idealistic, but what about liability? Insurance? What happens when community decisions conflict with building codes or zoning requirements? What happens when people disagree about priorities? Same things that happen in any development project, Rosa replied with a smile. Except the people making decisions are the ones who have to live with the consequences. The afternoon stretched into evening as the conversation evolved from theoretical possibilities to specific planning. Mrs. Chen offered her store as a meeting place for ongoing discussions. Marcus volunteered to research successful community land trust models in other Chicago neighborhoods. Even David found himself agreeing to help with financial planning and legal structure research. But it was Lara's quiet observation that gave weight to all the enthusiastic planning. 52 years I've lived in this house, and this is the first time I've felt like I had any say in what happened to my neighborhood. The statement carried the authority of someone who'd watched communities rise and fall, who'd survived urban renewal and white flight and the slow hemorrhage of disinvestment. Her endorsement wasn't just personal, it was historical validation that what they were discussing represented genuine change rather than well-intentioned repetition of failed strategies. As people began gathering coats and making plans for follow-up meetings, Jake lingered behind, clearly struggling with something he needed to say. Mrs. Kowalski, I need to tell you something. My company has options on 3 properties on this block already, including the Henderson house across the street. The admission created sudden tension in the warm kitchen. Rosa's expression sharpened, and David looked like he was calculating the implications of option contracts and development timelines. I could exercise those options, proceed with traditional development, probably make a substantial profit, Jake continued. Or I could let them expire, forfeit the money I've already invested, and try to figure out how to make this community ownership thing actually work. What do you want from us? Lara asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of developers bearing gifts. Honestly, I want you to convince me that this is possible. That community-controlled development isn't just a beautiful theory that falls apart when it meets zoning boards and construction loans and all the practical realities that make traditional development so traditional. It was Rosa who answered, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd spent 3 years learning that beautiful theories only mattered if they could survive contact with ugly realities. Mr. Morrison, a week ago Mrs. Kowalski was facing a choice between freezing to death and leaving her home forever. Today she's sitting in a warm kitchen, surrounded by neighbors planning the future of their community. If we can solve a crisis that fast when we work together, imagine what we could accomplish with actual time and resources. The challenge hung between them as Jake made his calculations. Profit margins versus community impact, proven strategies versus uncertain experiments, individual success versus collective possibility. Outside, the winter night was settling over a neighborhood that had spent the week discovering it was more resilient than anyone had imagined. Inside Lara's kitchen, warmed by Tony's rebuilt furnace and sustained by connections that crisis had revealed, the future was being negotiated one conversation at a time. The bigger picture was finally coming into focus, and it looked nothing like anyone had expected. The community meeting that would test everything they'd built was scheduled for a sweltering Tuesday evening in late July, when the community center's ancient air conditioning had given up entirely, and tempers were already running short before anyone opened their mouths. 6 months after the furnace crisis had brought them together, the first real fractures in their unity were beginning to show, not dramatic breaks, but the kind of hairline cracks that could either be repaired or widen into permanent divisions. Lara arrived early, partly from habit, and partly because she'd learned that being present for the informal conversations before official meetings often mattered more than whatever appeared on Rosa's carefully crafted agendas. The folding chairs were arranged in their usual circle, but the easy camaraderie that had characterized spring gatherings felt strained. People clustered in smaller groups, voices carrying undertones of frustration that hadn't been there when they were simply fighting to survive winter. Mrs. Chen sat near the front, her expression diplomatically neutral, but her posture suggesting someone prepared for difficult conversations. Beside her, the Jimenez couple, who'd been among the most enthusiastic supporters of weatherization projects, wore the expression of people who'd discovered that community decision-making was messier than they'd anticipated. "The problem," Mrs. Jimenez was saying to anyone within earshot, "is that we're trying to please everyone, and that means we're not really helping anyone. My roof has been leaking for 3 months while we debate democratic processes and consensus building. Sometimes you just need to fix things that are broken." The complaint wasn't unfair. The community land trust application had stalled in bureaucratic review, delayed by questions about governance structures that seemed simple in theory but proved complex when lawyers started asking about liability and decision-making authority. Meanwhile, residents with immediate maintenance needs found themselves caught between community processes that moved slowly and individual solutions they couldn't afford. Tony Ricci entered through the back door, his work clothes suggesting he'd come straight from another repair project. His transformation from neighborhood pariah to essential community resource remained one of the organizing effort's biggest successes. But even that relationship was experiencing strain. The demand for his skills had grown beyond what one person could handle, while his commitment to community rates meant he was working more hours for less money than individual contracting would provide. "Evening, Mrs. K," he said, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot. "Furnace holding up okay in this heat?" "Like a charm. Though I'm more worried about keeping cool than staying warm these days." Lara's response was automatic, but she was studying Tony's face for signs of the exhaustion she'd been noticing lately. Community hero was a difficult role to sustain, especially when it meant being available for every emergency while trying to rebuild a business that addiction had derailed. Marcus Williams arrived with Keisha, both of them carrying the particular tension that came from ongoing family discussions about college departure dates and neighborhood obligations. Northwestern's orientation was in 3 weeks, and Keisha's excitement about biomedical engineering was complicated by genuine concern about leaving the community organizing work at a crucial moment. "Any word from the city on the Henderson lot development proposal?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. "Delayed again," Rosa replied, entering with an armload of documents, and the expression of someone who'd spent too many hours on hold with municipal offices. "Planning Commission wants additional environmental impact studies, plus community input documentation that meets their new public participation requirements." The delays were particularly frustrating because Jake Morrison's partnership proposal represented exactly the kind of community-controlled development they'd been advocating for: mixed-use construction with resident equity, local hiring requirements, commercial space reserved for neighborhood businesses. But translating community vision into city-approved development plans required navigating bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to exhaust grassroots organizing efforts. "Maybe we should consider the Riverside Development Group proposal," suggested Mr. Santos, speaking up from the back of the room where he'd been listening, with the careful attention of someone who'd spent months watching community meetings without participating much in the discussions. "I know it's not everything we wanted, but at least they're offering real money for real improvements that would happen this year instead of someday, maybe." The comment created immediate tension. Riverside Development had approached several property owners directly, offering cash purchases at prices significantly above current market value. The terms were generous for individual sellers, but would effectively end community control over neighborhood development, exactly the kind of displacement, through financial pressure, that the land trust model was designed to prevent. "Real money for real gentrification," Keisha replied with the moral clarity that made her such an effective advocate but sometimes complicated collaborative decision-making. "Mr. Santos, you've lived here for 20 years. Where exactly do you think you'll go if property values triple and your rent goes up accordingly?" "Maybe somewhere with air conditioning that works and streetlights that stay on and grocery stores that don't close at 6 o'clock, Santos shot back, his frustration finally finding voice. "I appreciate all this community organizing, but my family needs improvements now, not theoretical improvements that might happen if we can ever navigate all these bureaucratic requirements." The exchange revealed the fault lines that had been developing beneath their surface unity. Long-term residents were split between those who saw community control as protection against displacement and those who viewed it as an obstacle to practical improvements. Newer residents, like Rosa, brought organizing expertise, but sometimes struggled to understand the weight of decades spent watching promises dissolve into disappointment. Even committed advocates like Marcus and Tony were discovering that sustainable community work required personal sacrifices that became harder to maintain over time. David Kowalski arrived late, still wearing his work clothes and carrying the expression of someone who'd been calculating financial projections that didn't add up the way he'd hoped. His conversion to community development advocate had been genuine, but his accountant's training made him particularly sensitive to the gap between community aspirations and available resources. "How bad is it?" Lara asked, recognizing the look her son got when numbers told stories people didn't want to hear. "The weatherization program is $20,000 over budget, mostly because we're learning that these houses need more comprehensive repairs than anyone estimated," David replied, settling into a chair with the heavy movement of someone carrying unwelcome news. "The city grant helps, but it doesn't cover electrical updates that turn out to be required for safe insulation installation, or plumbing repairs that become necessary when you open up walls." The financial pressure was creating its own tensions. Community members who'd volunteered labor for neighbors' projects were discovering that their own houses needed attention they couldn't afford. The cooperative spirit that had emerged from crisis was being tested by the sustained demands of systematic improvement work. "There's something else," David continued, his voice carrying the reluctance of someone who knew his next words would complicate everything. "Ma, you got a letter from the insurance company. They're non-renewing your homeowner's policy because of the furnace repair documentation. Apparently, work done by unlicensed contractors voids coverage, even if the work was competent." The news hit like cold water on the overheated room. Tony's emergency repair had saved Lara's life, but the insurance industry operated on liability calculations that didn't account for community necessity or crisis response. Without homeowners insurance, Lara would be unable to maintain her mortgage, effectively forcing the sale that everyone had been working to prevent. "How is that legal?" Rosa demanded, her community organizer instincts immediately shifting into advocacy mode. "The work was professionally done. The system is functioning safely. Legal and fair aren't the same thing," David replied, with the weary authority of someone who'd spent years navigating bureaucratic systems that prioritized procedure over outcomes. "The insurance company doesn't care that Tony used to run a heating business. They care that he doesn't currently hold active licensing, and their policy language is very clear about unauthorized modifications." The irony was brutal. The community response that had prevented Lara's displacement during the winter crisis was now being used to justify her displacement during the summer organizing effort. Tony sat very still, and Lara could see him calculating whether his decision to help had ultimately made her situation worse. "There has to be a solution," Mrs. Chen said with the diplomatic firmness that had made her an effective bridge between different community factions. Insurance companies have procedures for documenting repairs after the fact. Licensing boards have processes for recognizing prior experience. Nothing about this situation is unique enough to be impossible to resolve. Except that procedures take time and money, and insurance non-renewal happens fast, Marcus pointed out, his medical training making him sensitive to the difference between theoretical solutions and practical timelines. Mrs. Kowalski needs coverage that starts when her current policy expires, not coverage that might be approved after 6 months of appeals and documentation. The discussion that followed revealed how quickly community success could become individual vulnerability. Every solution they'd developed depended on relationships and informal agreements that couldn't be easily translated into the institutional frameworks that governed insurance, licensing, and municipal approval processes. Jake Morrison had been quiet through most of the meeting, but he finally spoke up with the hesitation of someone who'd learned to be careful about offering solutions that might be perceived as developer manipulation. "I might be able to help with the insurance situation," he said. "My company carries liability coverage that could extend to community-supervised repairs, at least temporarily while we work out longer-term documentation. It's not ideal, but it might buy time for proper licensing and inspection processes." The offer was generous, but it also highlighted the uncomfortable reality that their community organizing still depended on individual relationships with people who had resources they lacked. Jake's willingness to help was genuine, but it also made their independence somewhat illusory. "What would that cost?" David asked, though his tone suggested he was already skeptical about community ability to afford commercial liability coverage. "Nothing, if it's structured as part of the Henderson Lot Development Partnership. The insurance company would see it as normal construction coverage, rather than coverage for unlicensed work." The solution was practical, but it also meant accepting the development partnership that several community members had been questioning. Success would require compromises that felt uncomfortably similar to the kinds of deals they'd been trying to avoid. Lara listened to the discussion with the attention of someone whose home hung in the balance, but also with the perspective of 72 years spent watching communities navigate change. The problems they were facing weren't unique. Every grassroots organizing effort eventually had to grapple with the gap between community vision and institutional reality. "I think," she said finally, "that we need to remember why we started this. Not because community organizing was easy, but because individual solutions weren't working. Mrs. Jimenez is right that my roof needs fixing now, not later. Mr. Santos is right that improvements shouldn't require graduate degrees in bureaucratic navigation. David is right that community projects need sustainable financing." She paused, looking around the circle at faces that had become familiar through months of shared work and occasional conflict. "But if we give up on community control because it's complicated, we're back to depending on other people's decisions about our lives. Insurance companies that don't care about community necessity. Developers who see us as obstacles to profit. City agencies that treat us like problems to be managed rather than people with the right to determine our own futures." The meeting continued for another hour, working through immediate problems and longer-term strategy, with the kind of detailed attention that community democracy required. Not every issue was resolved, but frameworks emerged for addressing the tensions that success had revealed. By the time people began folding chairs and gathering papers, the community had recommitted to the difficult work of collaborative decision-making, while acknowledging that their unity would be tested repeatedly by the practical demands of sustained organizing. Outside, the summer night was finally beginning to cool, and Lara could hear the sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening routines, children being called in from play, the distant rhythm of music from someone's radio, the comfortable murmur of conversations on front porches. The community they'd been working to preserve and improve was still there, still worth fighting for, even when the fighting got complicated. The test of time was ongoing, but they were still standing. The first snow of the new winter fell on a Saturday morning in early December, dusting Lara's front garden with the kind of gentle accumulation that promised beauty rather than survival crisis. She stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug warming her hands, watching the familiar transformation that turned her neighborhood into something temporary and magical. But this December felt different. Not because winter had changed, but because everything else had. The furnace in her basement hummed with quiet efficiency, its steady rhythm, a testament to both Tony's engineering skills and the community maintenance schedule that Marcus had organized. Every house in their community land trust now had backup heating plans, emergency supply lists, and neighbor check-in systems. The crisis that had nearly broken her 11 months ago had become the foundation for collective resilience that made individual vulnerability manageable. Through the falling snow, she could see the Henderson lot where Jake Morrison's community partnership project was taking its final shape. The mixed-use building rose 3 stories, its design reflecting months of resident input about everything from window placement to commercial space configuration. The ground floor would house Mrs. Chen's expanded grocery store, a community meeting room, and a child care cooperative that Rosa had organized. The upper floors contained 8 units of cooperative housing, not affordable housing imposed by outside agencies, but resident-owned homes with equity that would stay in the community regardless of broader market pressures. The construction process had been messier than anyone anticipated, complicated by the democracy that made every decision a negotiation. Arguments about paint colors had consumed 3 community meetings. Disagreements about pet policies had nearly derailed the entire project. But the building existed because residents had maintained control over decisions that would shape their daily lives for decades to come. David's car pulled into her driveway, and Lara smiled at the sight of her son unloading tools from his trunk. Saturday mornings had become their time for working on house projects together, not because she couldn't manage the maintenance, but because they'd both discovered satisfaction in collaborative problem-solving. His transformation from worried, distant son to engaged community member had been as dramatic as anyone's, though he still approached each project with the methodical caution that made him an excellent accountant. "Morning, Ma," he said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered through the kitchen door. "Tony said the basement insulation project is ready for drywall installation. Thought we might tackle that today if you're up for it." The basement renovation had been David's idea, converting Stanley's old workshop into a proper apartment that could provide rental income while keeping Lara in the main house. Not because she needed caretaking, but because the additional income would fund the kind of aging-in-place modifications that maintained independence rather than replacing it with institutional care. "Keisha's coming by around noon," Lara said, refilling her coffee mug and pouring one for David. "She's got ideas about smart home technology that could help with winter safety monitoring." Keisha Williams had surprised everyone by choosing to defer her Northwestern admission for a year, using the time to develop what she called community-responsive engineering, technology solutions designed by and for residents, rather than imposed by outside experts. Her project documenting neighborhood heating systems had attracted attention from urban planning researchers, but more importantly, it had created early warning systems that prevented the kind of emergency crisis Lara had faced. The morning's work proceeded with the comfortable rhythm they'd developed, David measuring and cutting, Lara organizing materials and providing institutional memory about which approaches had worked in previous renovation projects. The conversation flowed between immediate technical problems and broader updates about community developments. "Rosa got word about the city council vote," David said, positioning a sheet of drywall against the basement wall studs. "Community development demonstration zone status is being made permanent, and they're expanding the program to 6 other neighborhoods." The news was validation that their organizing model could be replicated, but it also brought new pressures. Success attracted attention from researchers, city officials, and nonprofit organizations, eager to document and scale their approaches. Managing that attention without losing community control required constant vigilance. "Any word from Tony about the heating inspection?" Lara asked, though she knew the answer from David's expression. "Passed with flying colors." City inspectors said it was some of the most professional residential HVAC work he'd seen, especially considering it was community-supervised rather than corporate contractor installation. Tony's licensing had been restored 6 months ago, a bureaucratic victory that Rosa had orchestrated through patient advocacy and documentation of his recovery progress. But more than individual redemption, the process had created pathways for other residents to develop construction skills through formal apprenticeship programs rather than informal crisis response. Mrs. Chen appeared at the basement door around 11, carrying lunch and the diplomatic authority that had made her an essential bridge between different community factions. Her store expansion was scheduled to open in the Henderson Building's ground floor in February, but she'd already been using the space for community cooking classes that combined business development with cultural preservation. "How is the winter preparation going?" she asked, settling onto Stanley's old stool while David and Lara continued their installation work. "Better than last year," Lara replied with considerable understatement. The community's winter preparedness now included emergency heating equipment, food security programs, and support networks that activated automatically when temperatures dropped below safety thresholds. Individual resilience had been supplemented by collective infrastructure that made survival a community responsibility rather than personal struggle. "And how is your heart preparation going?" Mrs. Chen's question was gentler, but more pointed. "Last winter tested your heating system. This winter will test your community organizing system." The observation was characteristically insightful. The approaching winter would be their first full season operating as an established community land trust, managing not just individual households but collective property ownership, democratic decision-making processes, and the economic pressures that tested every cooperative venture. Marcus Williams arrived as they were cleaning up from the morning's construction work, bringing news that illustrated both their progress and ongoing challenges. His position as community health coordinator was now formally funded through a combination of city grants and resident fees, providing healthcare navigation services that reduced emergency room visits while improving overall neighborhood wellness. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter graduated from the Child Care Cooperative's early childhood program, he reported, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his designated spot for community updates. Full scholarship to a magnet elementary school, testing scores that put her in the top 10% citywide. The success story represented exactly the kind of long-term community investment that justified their organizing efforts. Children thriving because their families had stable housing, quality early childhood education, and support networks that reinforced rather than replaced parental care. "There's other news too," Marcus continued, his tone shifting to acknowledge complexity that accompanied success. "Jake's development company got approached by a national nonprofit wanting to franchise our model. They're offering significant funding for expansion, but they want standardized processes and outcomes measurement that might not fit how we actually make decisions." The opportunity represented both validation and threat. Resources to expand their model could help other neighborhoods develop community-controlled development, but institutionalizing their approach risked losing the flexibility and resident responsiveness that made it effective. "What do you think?" David asked, though Lara could see him already calculating the financial implications of different partnership structures. "I think," Lara said slowly, "that we've learned to be careful about opportunities that require us to change how we work in order to access resources that let us do more work." The afternoon brought a steady stream of neighbors stopping by for informal updates and conversation. Rosa with reports about policy advocacy, Tony with tools borrowed and returned, Keisha with documentation about energy efficiency improvements that were attracting research attention from engineering programs. By evening, as snow continued falling outside her windows, Lara sat in Stanley's old recliner, surrounded by the evidence of community that had emerged from individual crisis. The house was warm, but more than that, it was connected to a network of relationships that provided security no heating system could match. The photographs scattered around her living room now included recent images alongside the historical ones: community meetings, construction work parties, children playing in gardens that neighbors had planted collaboratively. 53 years of life in this house, with the most recent year revealing possibilities she'd never imagined. Outside, the neighborhood settled into winter routines that balanced individual household preparation with collective resource sharing. Lights glowed in windows where families felt secure in their housing. Steam rose from chimneys that vented efficiently maintained heating systems. Children's voices carried across front yards where safety came from community attention rather than individual isolation. 10 winters ago, she'd moved into this house as a young wife with dreams of raising children and building a life. 10 winters ago seemed like both yesterday and a lifetime, measured not in calendar years but in the accumulated weight of love, loss, and the discovery that survival could become transformation if enough people committed to the work. The community they'd built wasn't perfect, Democracy was messy, maintenance was expensive, individual needs sometimes conflicted with collective decisions. But it was theirs, shaped by their choices and sustained by their relationships. Home had become not just a place, but a network of mutual care that could weather whatever storms the future might bring. As she prepared for bed, Lara turned off the lights, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges requiring community solutions. But tonight, in a house warmed by both efficient heating and efficient love, she felt the particular satisfaction that came from having chosen to fight rather than surrender, to build rather than abandon, to trust in the possibility that neighbors could become family if they worked hard enough at caring for each other. 10 winters strong, and counting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,